Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to this week's edition of Imperial as One's Belonging series, where we explore the lived experiences of individuals from the Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. And it's about the stories. It's about hearing individuals' lives and how they've been able to transition and make meaning from it and gain their sense of belonging. And this week we've got a really special guest. It's Professor Ollie Folayan. And Ollie, I've seen his work and I've got an idea of what he does, but I think when you hear it from his mouth, you'll really understand his passion. Ollie is a chartered chemical engineer, and he's working in the energy industry, and he's the co-founder of the Association for Black Engineers in the UK and Scotland. So Ollie, it is such a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Oh, thank you very much.
All right. And what I'd like to just start off by asking is, can you give us a little sense of what it is that gave you your sense of identity, sense of belonging as you were growing up?
I think it would be one word. It would be family.
Right.
I grew up in a very sort of tight-knit family. There were four of us, and much of my childhood I spent at just various social events, mostly linked to church, actually.
Right.
And so I would say that sense of belonging has always come primarily from family.
From family. And how was it that they gave you that sense of who you were? What was it that they instilled in you as you were growing up?
Yeah, so it was mostly just a sense of a set of values, I mean, my dad would often quote this poem to me from I later found out was written by Wandsworth, which was the great heights that are reached are kept when not attained by sudden flights, but they, while their companions slept, kept toiling through the night. And those are the kind of things that he would actually force me sometimes to recite. But it was those lessons, those stories. I grew up listening to a lot of stories, from various sources. I was as likely to listen to or read the classics, whether it's Oliver Twist or just the Silas Marner.
Yeah.
As I was likely to learn stories from African folklore. So it was all of those things that created in me a sense of, it taught me the importance of being fair to others. It taught me this idea that actions have consequences. And that sometimes doing the right thing isn't always popular. So those are things that were sort of ingrained into me. And I remember my dad used to say that if you are not born with a silver spoon, and we certainly weren't, that you have to work hard. He says some people are born in it, but you have to work hard to achieve in life. So it was those sense of values that gave me a very strong sense of identity, one that was very difficult to shake off when I started to grow older.
So from a very early age, it was an eclectic mix of values which were given to you.
That's right.
And helped to promote you or to promote what you've been doing for the rest of your life, as it were.
That's right. That's right.
Where did you come in the family? Were you the eldest, the middle?
I was the second. So second, I think we do have a slightly rebellious streak, and so I had an older sister and the two younger sisters, and I had only sisters, and I was. I tried to negotiate with my mum. I thought all she needed to do was go to McDonald's to get me a brother, but that never seemed to happen. So that was my life, constantly trying to negotiate with my mother. I need a brother.
So having sisters is a great thing. It's a great lesson that you learn.
But this is true. But I did have a rude awakening when I turned 18 because I discovered that most of the male friends I thought were my friends weren't actually coming to the house to see me. So
well, that's that is a rude awakening. That's wonderful. So, as you were growing up, what were the things that influenced you? You said about the church, you said about your family, and the fact that you enjoyed reading and things like that. But were there anything, or was there anything that kind of like, in terms of education, what was it that your parents instilled in you from an educational perspective?
So I always had this balance. See, my dad was a bit of a pessimist, a
Mhm,
very very nice man, but a
mhm,
bit of a pessimist. My mom was a bit of an optimist, and so I generally would be told, however well I did, that sense I always got the sense from my dad that he wanted me to do better. And
yeah.
so, you know, if I had lots of good results and maybe one of them wasn't quite as good, says what happened, and we would talk as though there was nothing else good that happened. Whereas my mum is the one who would often say, encourage me not to compare myself with
Mhm,
some of my friends. I generally, when I was younger, I really admired nerds and
mhm,
I admired people that were very smart. And so
mhm,
I guess I had a tendency to weigh up anything I was doing against them. And I'm
mhm,
not quite sure how, but I've ended up most of my life making friends with people who just turn out to be really clever.
mhm.
And I've come to the conclusion that perhaps there is some sort of balance in life that for every clever person there must be. Anyway, um, yeah, so that sort of environment in which I had the optimist and the pessimist. I remember once coming back from school, the expectations on me were quite high, and so when I had done some of my STEM subjects and didn't quite get the highest grade, I got a very good grade, but not quite the highest grade. My teacher said, "Oh well, that's too bad." And I went home and I shared that with my mum. And my mum didn't say anything. She was preparing to go out. She just came back to me and says, "Here's your average score." Says if he doesn't think that's good enough, he can go to Blazers. So that was her attitude,
Yeah.
and I think I needed both influences to ensure that I never thought I'd somehow arrived, but at the
Yeah.
same time I did have a foundation that was not easy to shake off later in life.
Yeah. So they instilled in you the ability to work hard and to
That's right.
work hard, but also that you found a passion. It sounds like you found a passion from an early age for
That's right.
studying.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. Because my dad used to say that in this big polygamous African family that he was brought up in,
Yeah.
he used to say that he was number 23 in the line of engineers in the family. And so I had all of those influences around me. I never really met the other 22, but I
Yeah.
believe him. And so he used to say that he was number 23. So I certainly grew up with a sense that surely these things are possible, and
Mhm,
you know there are no barriers in that sense,
mhm.
even though my real inspiration for eventually becoming an engineer came from a much darker source. Would you like me to share that?
Yes,
Or
please. Please share
yeah,
that
so
source, man.
when I was younger, I read a book, and it was a book about. In that book, one of the key characters was an evil genius, and this evil genius he was able to use chemicals and solar energy to do lots of horrible things. But I remember as a 9-year-old reading about his how powerful he was, and all the things that he could do. And I remember thinking as a 9-year-old, that's my kind of guy. I want to be like him. And so I remember asking my dad, how many chemicals do chemical engineers make? And when he said any chemical, I thought, I know what I want to be. I want to be a chemical engineer. Um, I did also have an interest often in trying to understand things and trying to understand how things worked. And so there are a few TVs that have been sort of destroyed in the process of turning me into an engineer. And so, yeah, that was certainly a source of consternation to my dad. But yeah, so those are my influences. So I owe my career to evil, but I'm pleased to say that my values have been transformed since.
I'm glad at that. So you no longer wanted to be. Can you tell me the name of the book? I know you told me before.
The book's called Mark of the Cobra. So
Mark of the Cobra.
Yeah, written by a writer called Valentin Alili, and he's a yeah, he was writing what was the equivalent of a sci-fi novel. It was written in 1981, so I guess I feel a bit old.
No, it's a good book. I have to go and see if we can get it republished. I did have a look before, but it is out of print at the moment. But so we owe part of your kind of like interest in chemical engineering to the fact that you saw someone who was able to develop using chemicals and solar and engineer things.
That's right.
So there's a couple of questions I want to ask. One, okay. Are you engineer number 24? In the
that's a really good question. I suspect not. I suspect that in the sort of larger family that I must have. I mean, I've got cousins that live pretty much all over the world. I've got a cousin who lives in Japan who's also an engineer, and so I'm sure I probably fall much further down the order. When it comes to the number of engineers. Sorry, I've just had.
No, it's fine. Right.
And yeah, but I certainly within my family there were 4 of us, and 2 of us are engineers. Myself and my sister Nika.
So within the family though, so from your dad's line, there might be others, but you're definitely on that engineering track.
I'm definitely one of them.
Definitely.
I've earned the right to speak at family meetings.
That's I like that idea. So in school, it sounds as though that you excelled. You did very well in school, and you enjoyed learning, you enjoyed kind of like hanging out, understanding. But in terms of then deciding to go off to university and gain your sense of who you were, how did that develop? Where did you go, and what was it that you decided to study to try to develop your passion for engineering?
Yeah, so those interests sort of led me down a path where I ended up going to the University of Sheffield, and I did a degree in chemical process engineering and fuel technology. But one of the things that struck me at the time when I first got to Sheffield is this was the first time that I was truly had a true sense of independence, and it scared me to some extent that I'm in this scenario where I could basically do what I want.
Yeah.
And you know, and I was pretty sure that there may be consequences, but there was nothing to deter me. There was no one I had to say, I had to sort of report to, if you like. Yeah. And that freedom did scare me for a bit. And I think I did go through a period of just trying to figure out who I was. And that's from pretty much every perspective. Yeah. But yes, I'm pleased to say that those values that were instilled in me meant that in many ways I prioritized values when it came to who I ended up being friends with and hanging out with. Yeah. And so that was really what kept me.
So there's something that you just said, which was about the it scared you, that freedom scared you. What was it about it that kind of, can you pinpoint what it was that was fearful about or scary about having that freedom?
I guess there is a sense of there is to some extent a sense in which having certain degree of accountability is actually freeing. And you know, we've all experienced this when you've got children who try and basically test the boundaries. Yeah. And when the boundaries are defined, you're sometimes surprised actually how happy they are after that. You think, well, I've just stopped you from doing this or going there, and somehow you seemed pretty happy about it. And I
Yeah.
think that's because there is a sense in which when we know what the boundaries are, we feel a certain degree of safety.
Mhm.
What happened was that I was in a situation where I could pretty much do anything. I was far from family. Pretty much everyone around me were people who I'd never met before.
Mhm.
And certainly in those days, universities like Sheffield did not have many people of color. There were people of color there, no doubt, but not
Yeah.
quite as many as you might find today. And so I felt a sense of, well, uh, I guess I was just aware that I did not have that protective
Mhm.
shields that came from a sense of accountability.
Just look on that a little bit more as well. In terms of not just accountability, but in terms of your sense of identity, sense of belonging, how did that affect you then? Because you said you were away from home,
Yeah.
you had that freedom, and you said
Yes,
that it was about a process of self-reflection.
that's right.
How did that, what was it that you were thinking about, and how did that help you to kind of like define, this is how I'm going to be when I'm at university, or this is how I'm going to be?
Yeah. Well, what university did was expose me to people who had very different views from me.
Hmm.
And I think sometimes it's just the shock of knowing
Hmm.
there are people that think like this, especially if you've perhaps maybe, I don't know, had a bit of a sheltered
Hmm.
life from certain kinds of points of view.
Hmm.
And so I think it was those things. A person says something, and it could be about anything. It could be
Hmm.
about morality. It could be about faith. It could be about pretty much anything. And that would just set me thinking for a very long time, because it was the first time I'd heard some of those views expressed. And so
Hmm.
I'd spend a little bit of time, actually considerable amount of time, just thinking, how sure am I that I am right about, you know, the
Yeah.
things that I believe and the things that I consider to be true. And it was really those thoughts that I had to work through, and that was a slightly uncomfortable process. And actually, I think part of it was that I had initially had a mindset that says I will engage or relate with people who are perhaps culturally similar to me.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it was, I remember having the chat with my sister at the time, who says, well, no, your friends don't have to be people who are like you. And,
Hmm.
open up your sort of mind and engage
Yeah.
with people who are different. And that was really when I really started to enjoy my time at university. I made some fantastic friends. From very different backgrounds to me, but also people who shared the kind of values that I was raised with.
Hmm.
And I learned a lot from those people, and many of those people are still friends today.
Fantastic. So it wasn't necessarily a cultural, from a cultural perspective, or
That's right.
then it was more of a values that was
That's right.
more important,
That's
understanding
right.
that we have the same values and we understand it from a similar perspective.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. That's right.
Fan,
That's right.
fantastic. Just thinking on, after university, um and you now become an engineer, or you're on your way to becoming an engineer. Um, was there any doubt in your mind at any time to say that, maybe I've made the wrong decision, maybe I shouldn't be doing this? Or were there any challenges that you faced where you thought to yourself, well, actually, maybe I could go and do something else which wouldn't be as challenging as this?
Absolutely, absolutely. There have been doubts at different points, and I had a real struggle after my PhD
Hmm.
just to find work. And I
Hmm.
remember it was a year that was quite difficult for most people to find work
Hmm.
anyway, and so that was compounded by fears
Hmm.
about perhaps that there might be other factors, perhaps one wasn't good enough. And I remember applying and applying for jobs and feeling like I wasn't getting any success. And there was a point that I felt somebody must be having a laugh at my expense, because I used to go to a library to apply for jobs, and I applied for this job. I then went out and did some other things, and I got home. And before I got home, I'd already received a message that said, after careful consideration, we won't be moving you further. And I thought, well, that was 3 hours ago. How careful could you possibly have been in your considerations? But thankfully, I eventually found work. In fact, I ended up with 2 job offers, and I eventually chose one that was the one of the companies I'd done some of my PhD work for.
Yeah.
And then really many of the challenges started at that point. So I remember getting into work, and I was working in a situation where I was going to be the understudy to one of their experts. And I remember getting to the office, having going into this room and having a conversation with my then boss. And we started off with sort of casual conversation. And I remember him asking me about my family. And when I explained to him that my dad, who worked as an academic for most of his career, worked on an industry type project and then went back into academia. And when I said that, he said, well, failed engineers teach. And I remember thinking, okay, this is a slightly different brand of humor to what I'm used to.
Yeah.
But I didn't think much of it at the time. But by day 2, I was being told that your PhD is not worth the paper that it's written on. And this was not a response to performance. It was just day 2. But that started a process over a period of about 2.5 years of constant put downs, bullying in the workplace.
Yeah.
Most of the time it would happen in the open. And people would often ask, why does he browbeat you in this way? Why does he speak to you in such a condescending way? And it was pretty open. And you know, there were even other things that would happen. We would finish a piece of work, and I would get told, well, that work could have been completed without you anyway. And I remember once, one of the experiences that really sticks in my mind is that when my nephew was born, my older sister had her first son, and as was the practice in the office, quite a lot of people had personalized wall screens. And so I decided to put a picture of my nephew there, and he would constantly come close. He'd be coming to me to speak to me about some work, and he would look at the picture and he would say, that's an ugly baby. That's an ugly baby. And he would constantly says, when I look at that picture, I just feel, you know, he would say all kinds of things until he pressured me. He did that for weeks until he pressured me to take the picture off. A strange thing is when he had his son, he was quite happy to display that on his computer. There were days he would say, I've looked at your emails, I've read through your emails, and you've sent emails to people who are not they're not work related. And, you know, there were all kinds of things. And sometimes another person of color would come along and he would look at them and say, oh, you're worse than Ollie in front of me.
Oh my goodness.
And those kinds of experiences happened. But I never, at that time, never concluded that the reason for the hostility had anything to do with my race. In fact, I remember getting upset with somebody who suggested that. And the reason I didn't want to even think about it as a factor was I'd heard of people who constantly use race as a way of explaining away poor performance. And I didn't want to be like one of those people. Besides, we all have a certain degree of imposter syndrome when you're in a role. And there is a sense in which when a person tells you you're not good enough, that you believe them. And so for a long time, I did not want to attribute any of that to race. But over time, I started to meet other people from minority ethnic backgrounds who were also having these experiences. I started to hear people talk about minority ethnic colleagues behind their back. And that was when I started to realize that there is something here. And so I thought to myself, let's look within our organization. There may be somebody who is senior, who understands what the world looks like through an ethnic lens, who can talk some sense into me. I was looking particularly for someone who was a Black senior engineer, but there wasn't anyone in the organization who was in that position who I could go and speak to. I was living in Croydon at the time, and there was a lot in the news around young people getting involved in youth violence and knife crime. And, you know, I remember that one of the people, when I said there were other minority ethnic people I was speaking to, one of those people was my sister, who'd started her job 4 years after I did, and was having some of those kinds of experiences too. She had a black book that she would write her experiences in. In her words, she believed this guy was just a demon sent to torment her. And so it was a combination of the desire to find people in our organizations who, people who we could not find in our organizations, and then to use that group of people to reach the community, that eventually led us to found the AFBE.
So you founded the AFBE with your sister?
Yes, that's right. That's right.
So,
and my sister is the national chair of the organization, and I'm a co-founder, and I also lead the Scottish arm.
Fantastic. There was a couple of questions as you were recalling your experiences that popped into my head. Did anybody ever challenge this man? Even though they would say to you, why does he browbeat you like that? Did anyone ever challenge him and say, this isn't on, Ollie's doing a good job? Did anyone ever challenge him?
No, the closest to that ever happened was, there were people who would come to me, I would say behind him, I think he uses you as a bit of a dog's body, and he's not letting you gain the experience. In fact, I would say that was probably the more damaging thing. So it wasn't even just the behavior. It was the fact that when certain opportunities would come up, he would insist that I couldn't take them.
Yes.
And you know, there was a job that I led. It was the first time the company had ever had to look at a particular performance guarantee, and I led it. And I also the tests were being done in America. And in the natural order of things, I should have been given the opportunity to actually do that. But I never did. There was work going on that was very directly, closely related to my PhD. I never got the opportunity to do that. So there was also that denial of opportunities to really grow. And it was just this sense that you stick here. In fact, I remember sometimes I would be sent into a very old library, dusty old library, to find some of these documents from the 60s related to power plants. And I remember the librarian saying to me one day, he says, "Man, you get some shit jobs, don't you?"
So even the librarian was recognizing that this isn't right. Oh my God.
So I remember even that conversation, and that really cracked me up. But it was just an example of what we were being asked, or what my work experience was like, and the impact that had is that I eventually started to get really stressed, really anxious about going to work. I eventually, it did have an impact on sort of mental health, but also on my physical health, because it was at that time the certain illnesses that I still struggle with today were triggered. So there's that was what the impact of it was.
So this constant drip, because some people don't, they say there are no microaggressions, there are no things which are, but that constant drip daily, insulting your family by saying, you know, on multiple occasions, that eats away at you.
Yes, that's right. I hadn't even thought about it in that way, but that is exactly that's exactly it. So there were so many experiences like that were very unpleasant. Um, and really, it was a desire to push back, but it did set me up in a way that wasn't the best start to
Yeah.
my career. I am pleased to say today that I have moved much further in my career.
Mhm.
I wear four hats.
Mhm.
I'm a leader of a team of process and safety engineers at the company that I work for. I'm a visiting professor to the School of Engineering in Dundee. I'm a non-executive director of an engineering company, and of course I chair AFBE's Scottish arm, and I get to do so many things with both the Scottish and UK governments. And most importantly, I believe those experiences that I had are helping me to
Yeah.
be a more empathetic leader.
Yeah.
Yeah, they've been quite formative for me.
I'm gonna pull you back to the the work which you do for the Association of Black Engineers, because
Yes,
just to give us an idea of what it is that you do. And I think we've got a sense of your motivation, right?
yeah.
But it's a give us a sense of what it is that you do, and then we can look at some of those in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, so the aim of the AFBE is to help promote and make our industry, the engineering sector, more diverse.
Mhm.
We have a special but not exclusive emphasis on people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, and our aims are really threefold. We want to attract more people into the sector because although the studies would show that there is almost an overrepresentation of minority ethnic people who go in to study engineering, according to Engineering UK, it's about a third of all UK domiciled. So no internationals, UK domiciled students are from a Black and minority ethnic background. The interesting thing is that number can be even higher.
Mhm.
We meet people all the time who simply haven't chosen a path like engineering because they didn't know that it was something that they could do. I remember our team in London going to school, talking about engineering, talking about the work that engineers do. We had an engineer from the Thames Tunnel project talk about their work. We got the young people to build bridges with paper and test them with coins. We got someone to talk about CV writing. And there was also a presentation titled "The Contribution of African People to Science." Now, there's a young Black Muslim girl there, Fauzia, who hadn't really thought of engineering as something she could do, but that really inspired, connected with her. She started to be mentored by members of our team, including my sister. And she went on to study civil and structural engineering at the University of Leeds. And she's
Mhm.
been working as an engineer now for about 6 years. And
Fantastic.
we meet constantly various people like that. We have great stories like that in Scotland. Our first STEM event we had as a young girl there, Sunny, who went on to study offshore and mechanical engineering at Heriot Watt, contacted me just a little bit over a year ago because she wasn't sure if she was going to get into what she wanted to do. I invited her to one of our transition programs, and she went on to the transition program. She eventually ended up getting a job with that company, Leonardo, and there are many other stories like that. So we want to attract more people. The second thing we want to do is we want to retain the talent that exists in the industry, because there are multiple studies and our experience shows that simple things like what your name looks like when you apply for a job can make all the difference. The Nuffield Centre for Social Investigation at the University of Oxford did an experiment in which they created 3,200 fictitious CVs and they sent them out in response to actual jobs. Before they sent them out, they'd made sure that half of those people were people with white sounding names, another half of people with ethnic sounding names. And for anyone with an ethnic sounding name, they made sure they were either people who were born in the UK or had arrived in the UK by the age of 6, so that they would compare in like with like. So the
Yeah.
only difference is what their name looks like.
Yeah.
And they sent those out, and the results were published just 3 years ago in 2019. And what the results showed is that for the average person with a minority ethnic sounding name, they needed to send out 60% more applications in order to get a similar callback rate to somebody with a white sounding name. And the worst ones were people with a Nigerian or Pakistani sounding name. The team found they had to send out 80% more applications
Wow.
in order to get a similar callback rate to people with a white sounding name. And this is a repeat of an experiment that has been pretty much carried out every decade since the 90s. And so we know that that is a problem. And so we want to address that crucial gap by preparing our students for the workplace, preparing them for that environment. And then the third thing we want to do is we want to raise leaders. Our survey shows that Black representation on the boards of the top 100 engineering companies is lower than 0.3%. So, and people become what they see. So if we can encourage more people to progress into leadership, if that's what they want to do, we can encourage more attraction, and we can definitely encourage more retention, because people then see that there is a pathway to leadership. So, and then the other thing we do is we work with 65 corporations, including BBC Scotland, Mercedes Formula One, Microsoft, and many other corporations on their diversity and inclusion strategy. And we do that we have working agreements for a 12-month period where we work on specific aspects. So that's a summary of what AFB does.
Fantastic. So you spotted that, or from your experiences, you didn't have anybody who you could go and talk to. It's something which you said, which kind of like just pulled me back to something you said earlier, which was about careful consideration. That after 3 hours, they had carefully considered. And based on what you were just saying, we know what they were carefully considering, right?
We know what they were considering. That's why it can last 3 hours.
That's right. So you're adjusting or trying to create the space for young people to actually dream and see and feel that background.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And because a lot of it has to do with being prepared for the experience. See, for a lot of people, there is still a direct correlation in many communities between social deprivation and ethnic minority communities. And if you were not brought up in a certain kind of environment, being in certain corporate environments can be quite daunting.
Yeah.
I mean, I said my dad was an engineer, but I still remember feeling pretty worried when I was in those situations all those years ago. And so what we try to do is simulate that environment through programs like Transition. We take people through a mock interview, mock assessment center, and sometimes they go through they attend these programs so many times that when they're faced with a real thing, it flows naturally. I remember there was a lady who came along to one of our programs here in Aberdeen. She had then applied for work, and she was invited to an assessment center. When she attended, things flowed quite naturally for her, so much so that others were asking, have you been in an assessment center before? And she hadn't been in a formal one, but she's of course been in the mock sort of sessions. And she eventually got the job. She actually leads the transition program now for England and Wales. And so there are multiple stories like that that show that the program worked. We did a survey some years ago where we judged that we had a 70% success rate of the people that come onto the program and are able to secure a job in a relevant role within a year.
Fantastic. So you're actually making a tangible difference to the sector.
That's right.
Yeah, I like the idea of the development of future leaders, and the idea that people who have actually been through your centers are actually feeding back as well by coming and getting involved, because they've seen the benefit that it's had for their own careers.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. We had an interesting incident once where one of our engineers, one of our members, wrote an article. He's a fantastic high flyer, if you like, promising guy, and he wrote an article in The Engineer. And he talked about his involvement in so many organizations, including the ICME, and then he mentioned AFB as well. And then someone wrote a comment, said, I'm not racist, but usually when they say that I'm not racist, but you should get worried. It says I'm not racist, but it says it's great that you mentioned the IKME. I don't understand why you have to talk about the AFBE. And his answer was, well, actually, it was groups like the AFB that encouraged me to be an engineer in the first place.
Yeah, because no one else is giving them the space.
That's right.
If after careful deliberation, they're
Yeah,
not giving the space. So you have to be better.
that's right.
There's one question that I wanted to ask, which was about you said that your father was an engineer. Did you ever speak to him about his experience when he was when he was doing his engineering, and how he was perceived and viewed, and compare and contrast the experiences that yourself and your sister had?
Yes, he certainly shared his experience in the 70s with us.
Mhm.
And he spoke about times when a lecturer would be he would be walking in a direction, they would just change direction because they didn't want to speak to him. And he certainly reflected a lot of those experiences of that denial of presence, which is a huge aspect of the racism that people experience. And so he did prepare us for that world in a way. I suppose there is always that perception that that as time goes on, that things improve.
Mm.
But we know that that isn't necessarily a direct correlation. As I often say, racism in particular is not a time dependent variable, it's a power dependent variable. And that is why this imagination that we sometimes have of an invisible arrow of time that leads us inexorably towards a non-racist future is flawed, because that the truth is it just mutates into more socially acceptable forms.
Yeah, yeah. I'm just thinking about what you said there in terms of what your father experienced in the 70s, what you then experienced when you were, and what your sister experienced. One of the things your nephew, if he decides to follow the family trait and become an engineer as well, right? What would you like him to be able to see?
Well, I want to do the work today. And, just going back to this thing about things being power dependent and not time dependent, what that means practically is that until there is a change in perception, and therefore a change in the way people are perceiving these organizations, there won't be a change. I mean, you only need to look at the experience of people like Professor Chris Jackson, who we've been talking about even just recently, to know that that the things simply just mutate. So what I want to do is I want to give them the idea that there is no limits to what they can experience. I certainly don't want them to have the barriers at the forefront of their minds, but I also want to do the work in my time so that people who come into the workplace have a better experience. And through this time of COVID in the last few years, our organization has been running STEM sessions, Saturday sessions. And I remember on one of those occasions, my nephew attended, and he just said, I want to be an engineer, almost spontaneously. As a result of in fact, it's got to a point now when his mom says, would you like to attend? He says, but I want to be an engineer. I don't want to hear about doctors. and, and certainly that's part of the work that we're doing, inspiring the next generation. But until we actually do the kind of work that we're trying to do with these corporations, I believe that those people may end up in similar situations. So I'm optimistic about the future, but I'm optimistic. My optimism is tempered by the realization that we all need to do the work in order to ensure champions, allies, all of us must do the work to ensure that the path is smoother for those coming after us.
Fantastic. I'm going to just, at this point, I normally would open up to ask if there's any question. Crystal has already got her hand up. So Crystal, please ask your question.
Yes, thanks very much. Can you hear me all right? Oh, maybe no. Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Ollie, this has been really interesting. I do have a question though, which is so you cited the study from before where you know the name of the individuals had kind of this impact on the sifting of the CVs, and then your program is kind of preparing people so that they're skilled, they're ready to kind of address whatever comes at them in the assessment, and you're seeing a positive impact. But I guess what I'm wondering is that requires they already be called in for an assessment or an interview. So that's not really getting at that bias that we know exists already with the CV sifting.
This is correct. Yeah, that's right.
And so I guess I'm wondering if you have any ideas as to, you know, what can actually be done to address that first step, right? Because the second step is almost really perpetuating this myth of, or not this myth, but it's really perpetuating this idea that minorities are required to be better than everyone else, right?
This is right. Absolutely. The unintended consequence, and I've become even more mindful of that in recent years. The unintended sort of implication of the kind of programs that we run is that it risks perpetuating the idea that it is the people of color that need fixing, when it is always a little bit of this and a little bit of that. It's never one thing. And so what we've been trying to do in organizations is just make them aware. I cannot overemphasize the power that it gives to a potential ally or person just trying to do the best job that they can, if they are aware of some of the disparities, if they are aware of studies like the GEM study, which is a wide study that was done not just in the UK, but other European countries. If they're aware of it, they become a little bit more mindful of that risk of bias, and they put in measures to ensure that those biases are taken care of. One of those is obviously blind CVs, even though I often insist that blind CVs are not enough in and of themselves to prevent bias. It must be coupled with a number of other measures. And so I certainly think that this is the reason why simply preparing the candidates to bypass the bias isn't sufficient. It must also include a process of making the companies aware. For example, most companies aren't aware that even when you look at that 31.8% that go and study engineering or technology at university, they're not evenly split between the Russell Group universities like Imperial and a lot of the other universities. And so if people are aware of that, I mean, I know that almost naturally, if I was looking at two CVs, one's maybe from the University of East London, the other's from Imperial, naturally I would lean probably towards the one from Imperial just because it's a lot harder to get into. But if I'm aware that actually, if I also want to diversify the pipeline, that person I'm trying to employ is more likely to be in some of the other universities than in a Russell Group university, I start to look a little bit more closely at the CV. And so these are the kind of things that we are doing with companies. Some of the programs we run with organizations, we run the transition program alongside them so that they are directly targeting. It's a positive action program. So they're directly targeting people who could work in their companies. We have a focus group exercise where they get to hear the perception of people on the outside, especially minority ethnic people, of their company. And that helps to shape their policies. In fact, one of the things that we are launching on Monday is an index for the industry, an engineering ethnicity index. It's going to be launched on Monday. We have a slick video that I will share with Wayne, and I'm sure could be shared with you on that. And thanks for giving me the question to do a shameless plug for our index. But yeah, so those are the measures that we can put in place. So it's a case of the both and, not the either or.
Yeah. Thank you for that question, Crystal. Brilliant.
I'm sorry, am I allowed?
You got another one?
Just a follow-up.
Please.
Sorry, just a follow-up. So that's fantastic. And then I guess I'm wondering if you're familiar with some of the work of Sam Friedman at the London School of Economics, when you were saying how you would treat a CV from the University of East London versus a CV from Imperial. One of the things that his work has shown in studying, I think particularly he was looking in kind of the finance sector in London, which was that, despite kind of diversity hiring when it comes to socioeconomic background, there still seems to be what he's coined a class ceiling, which is that, independent of, if you treat a CV from the University of East London the same as a CV from Imperial, certainly, individuals that come from different backgrounds do perform differentially in these environments. And so I know that your participants give you kind of feedback about their success, but I'm wondering if you know anything about how they actually kind of progress in their careers and whether there's still disparity at that level.
There certainly is a disparity the further you go. We have a flowchart that shows that is the case, and you're absolutely right to point out. I often say, and I was just saying this yesterday at another event, that any analysis of race that completely ignores the social class question is always going to be incomplete. So educating people about the intersection of race and class and how that also affects outcomes, and how that influences who we mentor, who we sponsor, and therefore who eventually makes it further, and who gets spoken up for in the boardroom, are all very important factors. And so you're absolutely right that needs to be considered. And you've just given me another sort of reason to make that point when we're working in organizations. So I wasn't as familiar with the work of Sam Friedman, so I will look into that for my own education. Thank you very much for that. But we certainly already have conversations around the intersectional aspects of diversity.
That's it. Marge, you're going to be my final question.
Hi, thanks, Wayne. Ollie, that was absolutely amazing. Thank you, my brother.
Thank you.
Thank you, but it'll get silly. A couple of points I wanted to make, picking up really from what Crystal has said in terms of that earlier line into the pipeline, and you referred back to the blind CV. One of the things I have found is that, whatever means it is to help people get in, to help Black people get in, whatever means, and then it's really trying to support them so that once the representation is there, then that they can do something from the inside. So I think that's really important to have that ongoing, and I get the feeling, and from what I've listened to, that happens to help them, because once they're there, whatever means, it then starts giving representation, because that becomes really difficult. And I'm going to link that even to the study to do with the finance sector, because I was just actually talking to some individuals from the finance sector about 2 days ago on the very thing. The FCA has said that in terms of Black people in the finance sector, things are getting worse, not better. And that's a study from last year. But part of that, what's been found is that there are very few studies about progression. And we need to look at progression, and we need to just not stop it at have we employed a certain number. So that's really quite critical, I'd say, that support that is given within that, and again, especially to women within the sector, that intersectionality of Black and being female. Well, it's it's like the death knell, as it were. There really is a lot of need for support. So I am so grateful, my brother, for what you're doing, and please keep it on. Keep on.
Oh, well, thank you. That I feel energized just listening to that. That was really really powerful. And you're absolutely right that when we talk about these within organizations, the first work that needs to be done is not to make the company more diverse. Actually, It's to make the company more inclusive. It's to
Right.
help people understand this idea of hierarchies and how those work within organizations, and how it is possible, even in a hierarchical organization, to devolve some degree of power so that there is true inclusivity. And then when you have kind of started to move on that, then start bringing the people in, because otherwise they come into an uninclusive environment, and yeah, it's just going to be the same as what happened when they came in. I'll just tell you a very quick story. There's a friend of mine, Demi, who started working for a big oil and gas operator. And when she, that was many years ago. And when she started working for that organization, the company put out a buffet, a special reception to welcome all the young graduates. She was very self-conscious. She didn't want to eat too much because she was worried that if she was just going to sort of give the game away and, perhaps not impress the people around. And then she looked to the side and she noticed that her friend, also a Black person, was eating everything he could. And she just walked up to him and says, "Oh, we need to be careful." And the friend says, "Demi, look around." It says, "You're never going to be CEO in this organization, so you might as well eat and enjoy yourself." and although it's quite a funny story, it does illustrate what it looks like in organizations, and why it is often said that most of our organizations look like a pint of Guinness, white at the top and black at the bottom.
Oh, yeah.
What we want to do is change it to a latte.
That's right. I'm got my final question, because
Yes.
just because it is my final. What would be the wow factor? What would be the wow factor, looking back over what you've done, what you want to do? What would be the wow factor that would have transformed, instead of having that evil genius as the person who inspired you? What from your life would you say would be, wow, I want to be a chemical engineer. I want to do what I'm doing.
The honest truth about that is that I feel like I'm still working towards it.
Yeah.
I'm still working to that bright day where I feel like my whole engineering ability is actualized. I've worked on numerous successful projects, and there are structures or plants out there that I could drive past, and I could point to a young person and says, I was involved in building that. But if I'm really honest, or maybe it's just the mark of how much I still want to do, is that I believe that bright day is still ahead of me.
Fantastic. Ollie, it's been an absolute privilege to have this conversation with you. And please do send me through that index, and I can share, or the launch of your index, so that we can share that with others, so we can actually see what the information is that's there, because I think it's vital. And you have our support. We are here to help you in whatever way, because we know that each hand rubs against each other. Each one has to work together to make it a better place for everyone.
That's right.
Okay.
So, well, thank you so much for this opportunity. I've really enjoyed it, and I feel like I've gained a lot even from the questions that have been asked. So, yeah, I'd love to carry on speaking to everyone, Crystal, Marge, everyone who's asked me a question, because I feel like there's a lot I can learn from you. So
definitely. So I'm gonna just share with everyone next week's, who's our guest next week. This was Ollie, but for next week we're going to be having a young man, and his name is Quinton Smith, and he's a PhD student at the Department of at the MRC London Institute for Medical Science, and he's going to be sharing his experience actually getting into doing his PhD, and what's helped him to get to where he is so far. If you've missed any of the other interviews that we've done, then please go to our YouTube channel, which is tinyurl.com/belonging-IAO. There's other articles which you can see about some of the first 100 guests which we've had, and we're pushing on now with our guests. But none of this would be possible if it wasn't for the fact that we've got so many wonderful people willing to share their stories. And you know what, if there's any stories that you'd like to hear, let us know. Because you know what, all of us have a place where we feel that we belong. So Ollie, thank you so much. And
Thank you.
our guests, thank you once again for being with us. So we'll stop the recording now. And if there's anyone who wants to stay on,